January 1943. The sun hangs low over the dense jungles of New Guinea. The rhythmic hum of engines cuts through the silence. But it's not the roar of tanks or the thunder of heavy artillery. No, this is different. A small rugged vehicle, its wheels churning up mud and debris, races across the landscape. The Japanese forces, entrenched in their positions, watch in disbelief as this unexpected intruder barrels toward their supply routes. At first glance, it seems like a joke. A vehicle too small, too simple, too vulnerable to be a real threat. The Japanese commanders scoff. Their soldiers laugh. A jeep, a mere toy on the battlefield. What could it possibly do against the might of their fortified positions and heavily armed supply lines? But what the Japanese forces don't realize is that the jeep isn't here to fight in the traditional sense. It's here to disrupt, to outmaneuver and to carve through the heart of their operations. No heavy armor, no overwhelming firepower. Just speed, agility, and audacity. As the jeep races past dense foliage, a sudden burst of gunfire rips through the air. The driver, calm under pressure, swerves, expertly avoiding enemy fire. A few moments later, the roar of explosions fills the air. A Japanese supply depot erupts in flames. The jeep, seemingly out of place, has struck hard. Its mission complete, its impact undeniable. This is no ordinary vehicle. The jeep has just rewritten the rules of warfare, sowing doubt and fear in the hearts of those who once laughed at its simplicity. The Pacific War, 1941-1945, was a brutal contest of attrition, where every inch of land gained or lost could tip the balance of power in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. By 1943, the Allied forces were gaining ground after the devastating blows dealt to the Japanese Empire during the earlier years of the conflict. Battles like Midway and Guadalcanal had shifted the momentum, but the Japanese still held sway over much of the Pacific, entrenched in fortified positions on small islands and remote outposts. The U.S. Army and Marines, now more prepared and experienced, were pushing back with a new sense of determination. But the war was far from over. In the midst of this grueling conflict, the Japanese military maintained a complex system of supply lines and fortifications, crucial to sustaining their far-flung outposts. These supply routes were the lifeblood of their efforts, moving troops, weapons, and provisions across harsh island-hopping terrain. The Japanese had become adept at using geography to their advantage, often hiding their supply depots and staging areas deep within dense jungle or on isolated beaches, far from Allied air or sea surveillance. However, the Allies were not without their own ingenuity. In 1940, the U.S. Army sought a versatile, lightweight vehicle that could navigate the rugged, uneven terrain of the Pacific Islands. A vehicle that could carry supplies, troops, and weapons over muddy fields, through deep jungle, and across beaches, terrain that was almost impassable for traditional military vehicles. Thus the Jeep, a simple yet revolutionary design, was born. Developed by Willys Overland and Ford, the Jeep was initially dismissed by many in the military as a lightweight, disposable vehicle, unfit for the harsh realities of war, but the Jeep proved its worth in the field. At just 300 pounds, it was light enough to be airlifted and dropped behind enemy lines. Its four-wheel drive capability allowed it to traverse mud, sand, and snow, and its simple design meant it could be easily repaired in the field with minimal tools. Early in the war, the Jeep's role was more utilitarian, acting as a supply carrier, reconnaissance vehicle, and troop transport. But its true potential would soon be realized in ways that no one, not even its most ardent supporters, could have predicted. In 1943, the Jeep began to appear more frequently in the Pacific theater, but it was not yet fully appreciated for its strategic importance. For the Japanese forces, accustomed to traditional warfare with heavy artillery and infantry, the sight of a small, unassuming Jeep was almost laughable. To them, the idea of such a vehicle having any significant impact on their operations seemed absurd. They focused their attention on the larger threats: air superiority, naval bombardments, and the massed troops landing on their shores. But the Jeep's role was more subtle, more insidious. The U.S. military's commanders, especially those leading the island-hopping campaigns, began to understand the Jeep's true value in these environments. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a tool of disruption, capable of slipping through the gaps in the Japanese defenses and striking where they least expected it. With its ability to outmaneuver heavier, more cumbersome vehicles, it could penetrate deep into enemy territory, cut off supply lines and harass enemy units, all while remaining out of reach of conventional Japanese forces. By late 1943, the Jeep was beginning to show the Japanese what it could truly do. The Allied forces started using it in raids behind enemy lines, ferrying small commando units and reconnaissance teams to strike at the heart of Japanese supply depots, artillery positions, and supply convoys. The Japanese, so sure of their defenses, were caught off guard by the speed and efficiency with which the Jeep could disrupt their operations. The vehicle's role expanded from a utility tool to a highly effective weapon of war, undermining Japanese logistics and forcing them to reconsider their strategies. The Japanese would soon discover that the Jeep was not only fast, but relentless. Where once they laughed at its small size and simple appearance, they now realized that it had become a formidable part of the Allied arsenal, small but mighty, capable of delivering strategic blows that left them reeling. Human angle, the soldier's perspective at first. The men who drove the Jeep were often the youngest and most inexperienced soldiers on the battlefield. Their mission was simple: deliver supplies, scout enemy positions, or transport the wounded. For them, the Jeep wasn't a weapon of war. It was a vehicle of survival. But the realities of combat soon proved that the Jeep could be more than a utility vehicle. It could be a key asset in the fight. For those driving the Jeep, it was an intimate experience. The rugged, rattling machine became a part of them, almost like a trusted comrade. Soldiers would recall how the Jeep's engine roared through the jungle, its small but reliable structure, allowing them to dart through tight spaces that larger vehicles couldn't navigate. The light four-wheel drive vehicle allowed them to outpace enemy patrols and cross terrain that would have otherwise been impassable. But with each mission, it became clear to these soldiers that the Jeep was more than just a vehicle. It was a lifeline. In some cases, the Jeep acted as a conduit for soldiers to strike deep into enemy territory, often behind Japanese lines. The soldiers who drove the Jeep during these missions were often tasked with harrowing, dangerous work, delivering ammunition to frontline troops or evacuating injured soldiers under heavy fire. The personal stakes were high, and the men inside those Jeeps understood how pivotal their small, unassuming vehicle was to the Allied war effort. The connection between the soldiers and the Jeep was not just functional. It became symbolic of the new era of warfare that valued agility over brute force. As one soldier recalled, "You didn't just drive a Jeep. You became part of a new way to fight. You moved fast, you hit hard, and you made sure the enemy never saw you coming." Tactical angle, a game-changer on the battlefield. The Jeep's impact on the battlefield wasn't about its size or firepower. It was about its speed, agility, and ability to slip past enemy defenses undetected. The Japanese, with their reliance on larger, more conventional military tactics, were ill-prepared for a vehicle that could bypass traditional defense lines and strike where it hurt the most. Their supply lines, the Jeep's light frame and four-wheel drive capabilities, made it an ideal vehicle for the dense jungles, uneven beaches, and mountainous terrain that characterized the Pacific Islands. While Japanese forces were fixated on defending larger airfields or naval bases, the Jeep was slipping through their defenses and wreaking havoc in ways that larger tanks and armored vehicles could never achieve. It could cross rivers, climb steep embankments, and avoid detection by moving in the cover of the jungle. The Jeep's ability to outrun and outmaneuver larger vehicles allowed it to conduct lightning-fast raids, often striking enemy supply depots, communications lines, and artillery positions. It wasn't about overwhelming force, it was about precision and speed. These surprise attacks would not only damage Japanese infrastructure, but also sow confusion and disarray within their ranks. As more operations were carried out behind enemy lines, the Japanese forces began to realize that their once impregnable supply routes were vulnerable to small, fast-moving groups in Jeeps. In a war where speed and surprise were paramount, the Jeep proved to be an invaluable asset. Technological angle, the innovation behind the Jeep. At a glance, the Jeep might have appeared unremarkable, a small, boxy vehicle with a simple design. But behind its unassuming exterior was a remarkable feat of engineering that allowed it to survive and thrive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The Jeep was designed for versatility. Its four-wheel drive system, small footprint, and lightweight made it an ideal vehicle for the Pacific Theater's unpredictable and unforgiving terrain. Engineers at Willys Overland and Ford had created a vehicle that was both rugged and adaptable. The Jeep's relatively simple mechanics meant that it could be easily repaired in the field with minimal resources. This was an especially crucial advantage in remote areas where supply chains were often strained and skilled mechanics were in short supply. The Jeep's engine, while small, was powerful enough to push through thick mud and across sand dunes, giving it the ability to keep moving when other vehicles would be stuck or stranded. The vehicle's open design also allowed it to be modified easily for various roles, whether it was fitted with a machine gun for combat, a cargo bed for transporting supplies, or a medical stretcher for evacuating the wounded. This adaptability made the Jeep more than just a simple vehicle. It was a Swiss Army knife of military transport, capable of performing a variety of tasks on the fly. Its simplicity was its strength, and it's this combination of ruggedness, reliability, and adaptability that made the Jeep such a formidable force in the Pacific Theater. Leadership angle, strategy, and adaptation the key. Jeep's value wasn't just recognized by the soldiers on the ground, it was also embraced by high-level commanders who saw its potential as a force multiplier. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood that the Jeep's ability to move quickly and operate in difficult terrain could be the key to turning the tide in the Pacific. Commanders quickly adapted their strategies to integrate the Jeep into their operations. In one famous instance, the U.S. Marine Corps began using the Jeep to transport reconnaissance teams deep behind Japanese lines. These small mobile teams would gather vital intelligence on enemy positions and activities, which would then be used to plan larger offensives. The Jeep's ability to move quickly and stealthily allowed commanders to gather intelligence faster than ever before, which in turn led to more successful operations. The leadership angle also highlights the Jeep's role in empowering lower-ranking officers and soldiers. The vehicle gave commanders more flexibility in how they executed their orders, allowing for decentralized decision-making. The Jeep's ability to move quickly and carry out swift operations meant that commanders could take more calculated risks, knowing they had a reliable tool at their disposal to execute their plans efficiently. Enemy angle, the underestimated threat for the Japanese. The Jeep was a source of both confusion and frustration. At first, they didn't understand its purpose or potential. The small unarmored vehicle seemed out of place in a war that had been defined by tanks, artillery, and bombers. The Japanese military's conventional thinking focused on heavy fortifications and large, heavily armed units, leaving them ill-prepared for the fast-moving, stealthy operations made possible by the Jeep. The Japanese forces initially laughed at the Jeep, dismissing it as a novelty, a distraction from the real threat posed by larger Allied units. But the Jeep's relentless disruption soon made it clear that the Japanese had severely underestimated it. By bypassing their traditional defenses and attacking vulnerable supply routes, the Jeep began to slowly erode the Japanese war machine's logistical foundation. The Japanese were unprepared for an enemy that could strike quickly, vanish without a trace, and return again and again. As the Jeep's impact became undeniable, Japanese forces scrambled to counter this new threat, but their larger, slower vehicles were no match for the Jeep's speed and agility. The Japanese found themselves on the defensive, unable to prevent the small, mobile vehicle from wreaking havoc on their supply lines, and the more they tried to adapt, the more the Jeep seemed to elude them. Moral angle, the symbolism of the Jeep. The Jeep was more than just a vehicle in the Pacific Theater. It became a symbol of the Allies' ability to adapt and innovate in the face of overwhelming odds. It represented the spirit of the war effort, resourceful, quick-thinking, and determined. Unlike the massive tanks and bombers that dominated the battlefield, the Jeep was small, humble, and accessible. Yet it delivered a message that resounded across the Pacific. Even in the face of immense adversity, ingenuity and flexibility could win the day. For the soldiers who drove the Jeep, it became a badge of honor. It was the vehicle of the underdog, the unsung hero of the battlefield. Its success in the Pacific was a testament to the power of innovation and the belief that the right tool, no matter how small, could change the course of history. The turning point came in late 1943, during one of the most pivotal battles of the Pacific Campaign, the Battle of Bougainville. Located in the Solomon Islands, Bougainville was a strategic stronghold for the Japanese, who had fortified the island with heavily defended supply depots, airstrips, and artillery positions. The Allied forces, led by the United States Marines, had been bogged down in a prolonged campaign to take the island, facing fierce resistance from the entrenched Japanese forces. For weeks, the Marines fought bitterly, inching forward in what seemed like an endless struggle. The Japanese were well prepared, using their stronghold to launch counterattacks that stalled the Allies' advance. But the real battleground was not the heavy artillery or the fortified positions that the Japanese relied on. It was their supply lines, those critical routes that kept the Japanese forces supplied with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The Japanese depended on these supply chains, and they had spread them thin across the island, relying on heavily defended convoys that moved slowly and predictably through dense jungle. The U.S. command knew that in order to break the stalemate, they had to strike the Japanese where it hurt the most, by crippling their logistics. But the traditional approach, sending large, slow-moving tanks or amphibious vehicles, wasn't effective. These vehicles would have been easily ambushed in the dense jungle or caught in the boggy terrain. The solution came in the form of the jeep. In the days leading up to the battle, a small group of Allied officers, having recognized the jeep's potential in previous raids, devised a daring plan. They would take advantage of the jeep's speed and maneuverability, launching surprise strikes deep behind enemy lines to sever the Japanese supply routes. Their mission was simple: drive through the jungle, infiltrate Japanese-held areas, and destroy the supply convoys before they could reach their intended destinations. It was a gamble. The jeep was small, vulnerable, and lightly armored, but its ability to move quickly and navigate rough terrain gave it a distinct advantage. This was a chance to turn the tide of battle, to disrupt the Japanese forces at their most vulnerable point. If successful, the operation could cripple the Japanese war effort on Bougainville and send a powerful message to the rest of the Pacific. As the sun set on November 28, 1943, the operation began. A squadron of jeeps, each carrying a small group of Marines, set out under the cover of darkness. They moved swiftly through the jungle, their engines barely a whisper against the backdrop of the island's night sounds. The jeeps maneuvered through narrow jungle paths and over muddy riverbeds, avoiding Japanese patrols and striking at key points along the enemy's supply routes. Each jeep carried a small cache of explosives, enough to destroy the supply depots, fuel tanks, and ammunition caches that were the lifeblood of the Japanese forces. The first strike came at dawn. A group of jeeps rolled into a Japanese supply depot near the town of Torokina. The Japanese soldiers, taken completely by surprise, had little time to react. The jeeps quickly unloaded their payloads, explosives designed to create chaos and confusion. The depot exploded in a massive fireball, sending shockwaves through the surrounding jungle. The Japanese defenders, still disoriented from the sudden assault, scrambled to regroup, but it was too late. The jeeps were already gone, disappearing back into the thick jungle before the Japanese could mount any meaningful resistance. Over the next 24 hours, the strikes continued. Jeep after jeep, the small, agile vehicles struck at the heart of Japanese logistics. Fuel depots were blown to pieces, supply convoys were ambushed, and critical ammunition stockpiles were destroyed. The Japanese forces were thrown into chaos. Unable to move supplies or reinforce their troops, their carefully constructed defense lines began to collapse. The impact of the jeeps' raids was immediate and devastating. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, it was too late to defend their supply routes. The Allies had crippled the Japanese ability to sustain their forces on Bougainville. What had once seemed like a tedious and drawn-out battle was now a decisive turning point. The Japanese forces, starved of supplies, were forced to retreat to more defensible positions, while the Marines, emboldened by their success, pressed their advantage and began to advance more rapidly. The success of the jeep raids on Bougainville marked a critical moment in the Pacific War. It wasn't a major battle in terms of sheer casualties or tactical maneuvers, but it demonstrated the power of innovation and adaptability in warfare. The Japanese had underestimated the small, humble jeep, dismissing it as a mere nuisance. But it had proven to be a potent weapon, capable of bringing an entire campaign to a standstill by disrupting the enemy's ability to fight effectively. For the Allies, the success of the Jeep in this operation signaled the beginning of a new phase in the war. It proved that unconventional tactics, speed, surprise, and mobility could be just as effective as brute force. The Jeep, once a simple transport vehicle, had now become a symbol of how innovation and resourcefulness could tip the scales in the harshest of conflicts. The aftermath of the Jeep's decisive strikes at Bougainville was both immediate and far-reaching. The Japanese, stunned by the unexpected destruction of their vital supply lines, quickly realized they had been outmaneuvered. For the Allies, it was a victory that reverberated across the Pacific, one that would shape the course of future battles in the region. However, the consequences of the attack on Bougainville were not limited to tactical losses. The Japanese found themselves in a precarious position, forced to rethink their entire strategy for the island and, to some extent, show their approach to the broader Pacific War. In the days that followed, Japanese forces struggled to restore their supply routes. The depots, fuel tanks, and ammunition caches that had been wiped out were not easily replaced. Unlike the Allies, who had the industrial might of the United States behind them, the Japanese struggled with limited resources and a strained supply network. Without the necessary supplies, their ability to mount coordinated counterattacks or sustain defensive positions was severely weakened. The Japanese command, realizing the full scale of their losses, could only watch as their forces on Bougainville began to unravel. In the short term, the immediate effect was a shift in the balance of power on the island. The Allies, emboldened by their success, began to seize more territory. With Japanese logistics crippled, the Allied forces quickly gained ground, pushing the enemy back into more defensible but increasingly isolated positions. The Japanese, unable to resupply effectively, were left to fend off the advancing Marines with fewer and fewer resources. The outcome of the battle, once uncertain, was now all but sealed. By mid-1944, the Japanese were forced to evacuate most of their forces from Bougainville, marking the end of their defensive effort on the island. The tactical success of the Jeep's raids extended far beyond Bougainville. The raid itself became a symbol of Allied ingenuity and resourcefulness. What had once been seen as a minor, almost whimsical vehicle, the Jeep now stood as a symbol of how speed, surprise, and unconventional tactics could triumph over traditional methods of warfare. It was a turning point, not only in the Pacific campaign, but in the broader strategic thinking of the Allied forces. In the months that followed, the success of the Jeep's role in disrupting Japanese supply lines would be replicated in other campaigns across the Pacific. Commanders, now fully aware of its potential, began to integrate the Jeep more deeply into their operations. It was no longer just a utility vehicle or an infantry transport. It had evolved into a vital component of the Allied strategy, particularly in the dense jungles and islands where large, unwieldy tanks could not operate. Small, fast-moving units using Jeeps could outmaneuver enemy positions, strike quickly, and retreat before the Japanese could respond. The Jeep was now an integral part of the Allied war effort. On the other hand, the psychological effect on the Japanese was profound. The loss of their supply routes dealt a blow not only to their logistics, but to their morale. The Japanese had prided themselves on their ability to defend heavily fortified positions, and had long assumed that their supply lines were secure. The sight of small mobile Jeeps cutting through their defenses was a humiliating wake-up call. The Japanese military leadership, realizing that they could no longer rely on their traditional tactics, had to rethink their approach to the Pacific conflict. They began to recognize the need for more mobile, flexible forces to counter the Jeep's new role on the battlefield. But by then, the Allies were already a step ahead. The strategic implications of the Jeep's role in the Pacific were also felt across other theaters of the war. The concept of mobile warfare, where speed and agility replaced brute force, gained traction. The Jeep, in many ways, became the precursor to more advanced light vehicles that would feature prominently in post-war military doctrine. Its design and functionality set the stage for the development of future military vehicles that prioritized mobility and versatility over sheer firepower. On the home front, the American public's perception of the Jeep was forever changed. Initially seen as a workhorse for the military, it soon became a symbol of the ingenuity and resourcefulness that the U.S. military embodied. The Jeep's success in the Pacific, coupled with its role in other Allied victories, made it one of the most recognizable vehicles of the war. Its image was widely used in propaganda, representing not just the strength of the American military, but the strength of American innovation and resolve. For the Japanese, however, the Jeep was a constant reminder of their inability to adapt. It represented the unforeseen shift in modern warfare, where technology, innovation, and adaptability could overwhelm traditional military might. The Japanese forces, once masters of fixed defense and heavy fortifications, were now scrambling to adjust to a new kind of enemy that valued speed and mobility. The impact of the Jeep, therefore, extended beyond its immediate tactical success. It marked the beginning of a broader realization that the nature of warfare was evolving, and the Japanese military's inability to keep pace would ultimately be one of the factors that contributed to their downfall. As the war progressed, the Allied forces would continue to refine their strategies, incorporating lessons learned from the success of the Jeep. The small, rugged vehicle, which had once been dismissed as a mere curiosity, had proved itself to be one of the war's most effective tools. It had disrupted the enemy's logistics, boosted Allied morale, and played a crucial role in the eventual Allied victory in the Pacific. The story of the Jeep in the Pacific War is more than a tale of military tactics. It is a reflection of how ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience can triumph in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. At its core, the Jeep symbolizes the ability to turn simplicity into strength. In a war defined by massive bombers, heavy artillery, and large-scale battles, it was the small, unassuming vehicle that proved to be one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. The Jeep's success in the Pacific was a reminder that warfare is not just about firepower or size. It is about understanding the environment, recognizing the unexpected advantages of available resources, and being able to adapt quickly to ever-changing circumstances. The Allies' ability to see potential in a small, lightweight vehicle and leverage it to outmaneuver the Japanese forces demonstrated the power of innovation in warfare. It was a victory of the mind over raw might, a lesson that continues to resonate in military strategy to this day. For the Japanese, the rise of the Jeep was a humbling experience. In their rigid reliance on traditional large-scale tactics, they failed to anticipate the impact of a vehicle that was small, fast, and, most importantly, capable of slipping through their defenses unnoticed. The Jeep's disruptive strikes against their supply lines shattered their illusions of invulnerability, forcing them to rethink their entire strategy. In this way, the Jeep was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the changing nature of modern warfare, where flexibility, mobility, and technological innovation could outpace even the most formidable defenses. On a broader scale, the Jeep's impact on the Pacific War represents the shift in military thought that would define the post-war era. The success of small, agile vehicles like the Jeep laid the groundwork for future military developments, influencing how wars would be fought in the decades to come. The war would move toward lighter, faster units, capable of striking quickly and efficiently, rather than relying solely on heavy, slow-moving tanks and artillery. The Jeep, in many ways, was the precursor to this new way of thinking. The Jeep's story also serves as a reminder of the power of perseverance and the value of thinking outside the box. When the Allies first introduced the Jeep, few could have predicted its lasting impact. It wasn't just a matter of its capabilities on the battlefield. It was about the Allies' ability to adapt, innovate, and make the most of every resource available to them. The Jeep, with all its simplicity and reliability, became a powerful symbol of Allied ingenuity and determination. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Jeep may not have been the largest or most famous weapon, but its role was undeniably crucial. It was a small, seemingly insignificant vehicle that, through sheer adaptability and clever use, changed the course of the Pacific War. And in doing so, it forever altered the way military forces approached warfare, a legacy that remains to this day.